Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, September 14th, 2023. Matthew Ho joins us now. Matt, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. Our mutual friend and colleague, Phil Giraldi, career CIA, gave a talk over the weekend at the Ron Paul Institute in which he acknowledged, others have talked about this, but he acknowledged the existence of the CIA's army, which basically goes wherever the president wants it to go without the permission or knowledge of the Congress, or wherever they think the president wants them to go and kill who they think the president wants them to kill. How did the CIA, from your understanding, get a private army when they were established to be an intelligence agency just monitoring adversaries and potential adversaries for potential harmful activity against the U.S.?
It's an evolution that begins before the CIA is even created. With, I believe, you go back to those who were involved with the OSS, the predecessor to the CIA, and their actions during World War II. But also importantly, so many of their connections to Wall Street, to major corporations, to the Ivy League, so that they felt that they almost had this entitlement, to do this responsibility to do it, a noblesse oblige, to go out there and do things in the shadows, if you will, covertly, in order to get something done, because in their minds, the ends justify the means. And I think that got romanticized through the use of the offices of the OSS throughout World War II, in the sense of the saboteur operations and partisan operations and rescue missions they conducted against, particularly since Nazi Germany. And then that gets bound up into the CIA, which is created in the late 40s. And that is continued, particularly through the CIA leadership under Allen Dulles. It's useful. It's effective in their eyes. It's certainly not effective in the sense of actually producing results that are beneficial to American interests or to American allies. But early on, there are successes using these types of private armies in overthrowing governments, in helping stage insurgencies, in combating insurgencies. I mean, the list of where these private armies is this covert and clandestine operations take place, whether it be in Africa, in Asia, in the Mediterranean, in Central America. I mean, it just builds and builds and builds.
The last three presidents, President Obama, President Trump, and the incumbent President Biden, have actually used the CIA to conduct assassinations. Now, there's no statute of limitations on murder. Assassination of a civilian by a foreign government is a war crime. There's no statute of limitations on that. You don't have to be a member of the International Criminal Court. Your country doesn't have to be a member of the International Criminal Court in order for you to be prosecuted. George W. Bush has famously or infamously been under indictment by the EU, by a Spanish judge going back 20 years ago. He can't go to Europe without fear of arrest. Are these things ever resolved from the perspective of justice, or do the CIA killers just get away with assassinations because they believe they've been ordered to do it by the President of the United States?
Right. You know, it's not just the assassinations, it's the torture, it's the rendition, the kidnapping, the indefinite detention, and then plus the subversion of all types of foreign movements, entities, whether they be elections, whether they be press, the subversion of our own press. You know, the Church Committee hearings of the late 70s, it was famously discussed how over 400 American journalists were on the CIA's payroll. Now, supposedly that doesn't occur anymore. I don't believe that. I know you don't believe that, Judge. Anyone who believes that the CIA is not involved with the American press is, fooling themselves. This idea of whether or not whether justice is ever served, absolutely not. I don't know of any cases. There's, whether it be the torture, whether it be the extrajudicial assassination campaign by either drone or by commando mission. I mean, whether it be the indefinite detention. I mean, all these things that still exist now that occur now, that have occurred underneath the umbrella of the global war on terror, for which there has been no reckoning for. There has been no accountability. I mean, the CIA has spied on the Senate Intelligence Committee. They invaded their computers. I mean, you want to talk about that? Should have been a massive constitutional crisis, and nothing occurred. What occurred was that Avril Haines, who is now the director of national intelligence, she was put in charge when she was John Brennan's deputy of investigating this. And of course, no one was held accountable, and Haines got promoted to be DNI. So in terms of how it works in Washington, it seems to be working well the way Washington wants it to work.
Okay, two observations. There's only been one prosecution of a CIA agent for torture in the modern era, and that was for revealing the torture and revealing the names of those who participated in it, not for participating in it himself. John Kiriakaku. John spent 2.5 years in a federal prison. But you have argued as persuasively as anybody I know, Matt, that the war in Ukraine is the most propagandized war in the modern era. And the root of that propaganda can only be CIA and MI6. Some of our other friends, Larry Johnson and Phil Giraldi, think that MI6 is better at this than CIA. We're not going to get into a debate as to who better. They both do it. Do they bribe? Do they pay? Or do they just give secrets out in return for favorable press?
They do it all. I mean, they do it all. There's when you have the resources they have, when you have their abilities, when you have the weight that they carry, and their fact that they're unencumbered by the concern about ever being held to account, they do it all. They have a whole section within the CIA, a political activities division. Used to be what used to be called the special activities division. There is underneath that, alongside the special operations, the CIA's paramilitary commandos, a political action group as well. And this is what they do. This is what they specialize in. This is what their purpose is to manipulate reality, create reality, tell people what the reality is. And it's very effective. And they do it a number of different ways. One, they put people on payrolls. Others is just the influence they had. I mean, you go back, we've talked about this before, Judge, what a small group it actually is that controls things in DC. So when you go back and you look at, say, the Washington Post and the Grahams who used to own the Washington Post, well, who were they very close friends with? They were close friends with Frank Wisner. Who was Frank Wisner? Basically the guy who started out the covert operations section of the CIA in the late 1940s. You had that relationship. Look at it today. Who owns Washington Post now? It's Jeff Bezos. What's Jeff Bezos' connection to the CIA? Billions upon billions upon billions in contracts. So whether it's through personal relationships, whether it's through outright graft, because I don't know how you can claim that the person who owns the Washington Post is somehow firewalled off from literally, I think it's hundreds of billions of dollars in contracts he has with the CIA and the DOD. I mean, so you have all of that. And then, of course, you have the journalists themselves who want to be close to power, because proximity to power, Judge, as you know, is such a very real. I mean, I'm sure the stories you can tell from where you were in Manhattan for so many years in the media and seeing how people react to power and how they flock to it, will flatter it and bend over for it, right? I mean, this is what happens. So, I mean, you have examples, say, of Ken Dillian, who famously was sending his news reports to the CIA for them to clear it. And where does he work now? He works for NBC News. He's their chief national security correspondent, or one of them. This is a person who was exposed as giving his copy to the CIA for their approval before it was published. And what did he do? He got promoted to not just a bigger position, bit better title, but to a much larger media operation.
I mean, there was a time, this is before your days as an adult, much less in the military and in the State Department, the Vietnam War, when the press seriously challenged and exposed what the military was doing. This, of course, culminated in the Nixon years with the publication with the Supreme Court's ringing endorsement of the Pentagon Papers by our late great friend Daniel Ellsberg. But my point is, the press did its job. It was the eyes and ears of America, and it pressed the Johnson administration. LBJ famously said after Walter Cronkite returned from a trip to South Vietnam, I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country. I better not run for re-election. And that's what happened. That sounds inconceivable today in the Vietnam War. All we get is, I read the Wall Street Journal copiously this morning because these people are my friends. When I was at Fox, we all had the same bosses. We were in the same building. We rode the same elevator. We ate in the same cafeteria. We talked about the same things. And now they are just mouthing the government line. Ukrainian forces are moving eastward. They're gaining 1,000 meters, a kilometer a week. It's only a matter of time. Nobody else is reporting it. Nobody else is saying it. And I don't know anybody that's believing it.
It's part of the groupthink. I mean, we can't get away from the basic psychology of who we are, our evolutionary nature, our fear of, how our ancestors were, eons ago, who were scared if they didn't agree with the chief, they were going to be in the woods with the wolves, not sitting by the campfire. I mean, there is that impulse. And this is why you can have someone like a John Kiriakou, who was the only one punished for torture by the U.S. government because he spoke out about it. But when you talk to John about this and you read what John writes and everything else, and I encourage people to follow John, that when this idea of torture went around the CIA, they were going up to the CIA operations people and saying, hey, we're going to torture people. They were calling it, we're going to, use coercive methods or whatever their term was.
And the Dick Cheney phrase.
That's right.
Interrogation.
Enhanced interrogation. And John was the only one who said, I don't want to be a part of this, even though the other operations officers knew that what they were doing was wrong. It was illegal. And probably most important, I think, for professionals is that it was counterproductive, that torture doesn't work. But you could have this as well. You saw this in the Department of Defense. I went through the Department of Defense's SEER training or your preparation for prisoner of war training, and went through the torture camp and everything else, the prisoner of war camp. And I mean, what they teach you over and over again, Judge, in DOD, is that torture doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. That's what history teaches us. That's everything we know. Scientifically, we know it doesn't work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what do? First chance they get, they torture people.
They torture. Look at Gina Haspel,
Right.
who was the head of the CIA for, I think, 3 of the 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency, nicknamed by her colleagues Bloody Gina. Right. What the hell do you think that's all about? Well, we know what it's about. She supervised, crafted, and participated in torture all over the world. Let's segue back to Ukraine. You and I know from our observations and from our sources, and many of our sources are the same, that Ukraine is making no progress or no measurable progress whatsoever in moving eastward. We also know European countries are borrowing cash in order to send equipment and munitions to Ukraine. America is borrowing cash. Joe Biden just asked for another $28 billion. Kevin McCarthy says he's going to put that $28 billion in the Defense Department budget, thereby making it almost impossible to vote against. All of that is background. So my question to you, Matthew, is, how much longer can this go on? It's showing no progress. It's milking NATO and the U.S. dry of their storehouses of arms. I know it's enriching the military-industrial complex because probably for every 155 millimeter shell that goes over there, somebody in the U.S. is building 2. But how much longer can this go on?
It can go on as long as those who are in power have a political interest in it going on. I mean, of course, there could be a collapse on either side. It would seem more likely now that there be collapse on the Ukrainian side, just because the Russians have so many more resources, seem to be in a better advantage, haven't made the foolish, stupid decisions the Ukrainians have made this year in terms of defending Bakhmut and then launching this really inane and horrific offensive that just sacrificed so many for nothing. But as long as the American Treasury, the American dollar is put behind this, it can be funded. You have a question of whether or not Ukraine has the manpower. But, even with the refugees included, you're still talking about a country of 40 million people. To have a mobilized army of 1 million is possible with that, even with their refugee issues. And if you have, again, the American Treasury, the American dollar behind it, this is what the Americans did in Afghanistan. This is what we did in Iraq. We spent $300 million a day just in Afghanistan for 20 years. And this is something I think that has to weigh on the minds of the Russians, is that, yes, that right now you may have the advantage. But, in their article this week in the New York Times about how Russian ammunition production has increased even despite of the sanctions, something that all of us, except outside the New York Times, seem to know already. But, with that's the case. The problem is that the American Congress will throw money at this problem. And if we're only producing 30,000 artillery rounds a month now, or whatever the number is in the U.S., we can put the money in so that in 2 or 3 years' time, we're producing 300,000 rounds a month. I mean, it's a question of time, but certainly the money is there, the capacity, but it all gets back to the political will. So if the Biden administration thinks that this is in its best political interests to continue the war, particularly for its reelection campaign, it will spend the money to do so, and it will beat the war drum. It will shame people into being Putin apologists. It will show that Joe Biden is a strong, silent commander in chief. I don't remember, Judge, and if people who are watching this do, please put it in the comments. I don't remember re-election campaigns in 2004 and 2012 by the Bush or the Obama administrations toting their wartime leadership the way the Biden administration has already.
Right. I wasn't going to run this, but you sent it to us. Gary, do we have the Biden ad, right, that Captain Ho sent us? We're going to run it now. So everybody, obviously this is not Judging Freedom promoting the re-election of Joe Biden, but we want you to see what he and his PR people are saying about him. It's pretty slick.
It was the first time in modern history.
Very significant moment on the world stage.
That an American president went into a war zone not controlled by the United States.
A nearly 40-hour journey in and out of Ukraine.
President Biden left Washington, D.C. at 4 a.m. on Sunday. He landed in eastern Poland and then took a 9.5-hour train to Kyiv.
He entered Ukraine under the cover of night. And in the morning, Joe Biden walked shoulder to shoulder with our allies in the war-torn streets, standing up for democracy in a place where a tyrant is waging war to take it away.
Air raid sirens blared as the two men walked together.
In the middle of a war zone, Joe Biden showed the world what America is made of. That's the quiet strength of a true leader who doesn't back down to a dictator. Biden, President.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
So he wants to run as a wartime president. And maybe the answer to my question about how long this lasts is at least until November 2024, when if he does run. I still think he's not going to run. I think the Democrats are going to say, Joe, your time is up. But whatever, he thinks he's going to run, and that's when the election is.
I mean, we have to remember, too, that when faced with similar questions about what to do with a war that clearly was unwinnable in Vietnam and in Iraq and in Afghanistan, the decision was not to negotiate to find a peaceful settlement, not to negotiate to end the war, not to extricate ourselves from it, but to double down and escalate. And that's right. What was done, right? I mean, and that is what lives within the White House. That's the spirit of Washington, D.C. And so this romanticized narrative of Joe Biden as a strong, silent commander in chief. And of course, there's obviously the tying of with the whole Russia gate of tying Russia to Trump. And so when you watch that, right, he's talking about Trump as much as he's talking about Putin and everything else.
Yes. The implications
it comes
are clear.
back to what is in the best political interest. And so it's not about keeping Ukraine free. It's not about Ukraine's democracy. It's not about saving the people of Ukraine. It's about the White House keeping President Biden in it.
They must have taken a poll that showed them or run this before, one of those interest groups. They wouldn't just put it out there. Somebody must have advised them that this is going to work. I want to play a clip of President Zelensky. This is very, very telling. It's an interview with Fareed Zakaria at CNN, and he says things like the war can have no happy ending. And then he articulates, without using this phrase, but it's discredited, you and I know that, the domino theory. And then he says, very interesting, listen for this, Matt, this is not just our war, this is a common war.
It's not the movie with the happy end. We will not have happy end. We lost a lot of people. No happy end. That we have to recognize it. A victory, that's only one thing that can bring the occupation of our land. It means not to give possibility for Russia to attack other countries, Baltic, Poland, and then to bring all of us back, by this aggression back to USSR. We don't want. That's only position for this. Victory is not happiness. Victory is only one possibility to ally. And people in the West have to recognize it. Not our values, common values. Not our war, common war. We pay the highest price, it's true. And I don't want to repeat these words. Everybody know this word, but they can not only know. People in the West have to feel it.
People in the West have to feel it. I guess he meant common values, common war, common pain. I don't know. You think that's for domestic political consumption? I think he's on his last leg politically. He's just allowed the slaughter of too many of his own people, and he's got people to the right of him who want him to be more aggressive. I just don't know where that kind of an argument resonates here in the West.
I think he's still very useful to those in Ukraine because he is a rainmaker. He's very popular internationally. So he can go around, he can come to the American Congress, he can go to the British Parliament, he can go wherever and get the money. He can come to the United States, to the Brits, to the Danish, whoever, and shame us for not doing enough. And he's trying to make that connection where this is a common struggle. We are defending you from Russia. I mean, that's ludicrous, of course, if in a year and a half, Russia it can't take more than 20% of the land away from a non-NATO country. I don't know what the rest of NATO is concerned about. However, that type of idea that this is a common fight, that he's coming for you next, this very similar to the arguments we heard during the Iraq and Afghan wars. We have to fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them here. But of course, Judge, this is the purpose of a proxy war, so that your people don't feel it. Right? The money, the billions, the tens of billions, the hundreds of billions of dollars, that's funny money. That money doesn't really exist. There's no consequences for our government spending all that money. The $8 trillion we spent on Iraq and Afghanistan, no consequences for that. You're right. I mean, so it doesn't connect to people. And Zelensky, who I think recognizes the dire state that Ukraine is in, best case, they're going to continue on with this war where his country is going to be continued to be destroyed. His cities will be continually be attacked because this is turning into a war of cities, if you will, sort of like what happened in the Iran-Iraq war. And his people are dying. They're being mutilated. They're suffering. And best case is it gets frozen. That's the best case for him right now. Worst case, right, of course, is a collapse. He gets taken out in a coup, what have you. So he is desperate, but he is still useful, like I said, to those to the right of him because he is so popular among the nations with the money and the things Ukraine wants.
Captain Matthew Ho, always a pleasure, my dear friend. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, Judge. Appreciate it.
course, there you have it. I hope you like it. And of course, we have a lot more of that coming. Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski at 2:00 Eastern. We are up to 199,000 subscriptions. I have a feeling we're going to break into 200,000 this afternoon or tomorrow morning. Of course, you can talk your friends into doing that for us. We'll see you in half an hour. Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.